The woman arrived at dawn, cradling her son like he weighed nothing left to lose. She had heard rumors, a well that glowed, children who shouldn't have survived the winter, water the color of new grass in a land where nothing grew green. She didn't believe any of it. She came anyway. Spring came late to the high desert above Bracken Rise, arriving not with softness, but with wind that scoured the skin and light that showed every hard thing plainly. Ivy Mercer stood at the edge of the old well and looked down into the water, that impossible, mineral bright green, and thought about what her mother used to say. What frightens people and what helps them is sometimes the exact same thing. She was beginning to understand that now. The Mercer claim sat on a half-mile of hardpan and sagebrush 3 miles east of the Bracken Rise crossroads, far enough from town that neighbors measured distance in effort rather than miles. The house was a 2-room adobe with a patched roof and a door that swelled shut in rain. The barn held a mule named Consequential and 6 laying hens. The garden plot had been turned twice, but not yet planted. The windmill creaked. The fence needed mending on the north side where the posts had heaved in winter frost. Their parents, Daniel and Wren Mercer, had filed the claim in 1887 with plans for a proper homestead, fruit trees, a root cellar, eventually a proper well. What they'd gotten instead was 4 years of work, 2 modest harvests, and then a winter illness that took them both before February ended. They left behind 4 children and $31 in a tobacco tin under the floorboards. Ivy had turned 19 in March. She had taken stock of everything with the deliberate calm of someone who could not afford to fall apart. Seth, 16, had absorbed the loss into his hands. He was always busy now, always fixing something, as if stillness might let the grief in. Poppy, 13, had become quietly watchful, her dark eyes moving over every room, every face, cataloging what was needed. And Eli, 10, had decided, in the particular way of the youngest, that optimism was a tool he was old enough to carry. The well was the one thing nobody wanted to discuss. It sat 50 yards from the house in a ring of flat stones, hand-dug by some settler before them, lined with dark-fitted rock all the way down. The water at the bottom was not brown or clear or any expected color. It was green, a vivid, living, unsettling green, mineral-rich and faintly warm even in the cold months, sometimes wisping a thin steam on early mornings. Previous owners had covered it. The Mercers had uncovered it out of necessity. It produced water no one was sure they should drink. The Hendersons arrived on a Wednesday, their wagon listing from a broken spoke. Seth had spotted a 1/4 mile out. Mrs. Henderson was driving. Her husband Martin lay in the wagon bed, flushed and barely conscious, breathing in the shallow, effortful way Ivy recognized. She had heard about the fever working through the settlements south of them. 3 families already bedridden, 1 ranch hand dead. But this was the first she had seen it close. "I was taking him to town," Mrs. Henderson said. Her voice was even, but her hands shook on the reins. Wheel gave way. Ivy looked at Martin Henderson. She looked at the well. She had been thinking about something for 3 weeks, turning it over the way you turn a stone to see what's underneath. Something her mother had said, and something she had noticed herself. She had first noticed it on her own hands. In February, when the cold was worst and her knuckles cracked and bled from hauling water and washing in freezing air, she had let her hands rest in a bucket drawn from the green well, meaning only to feel something warmer than the wind. The skin had calmed almost immediately, not healed exactly. Calmed. The raw edges stopped weeping. By morning, they were better than they had been in weeks. She had told Seth. He had looked at her sideways. Might be the minerals, he said, which was his way of saying, I don't know what to make of this either. She had told Poppy, who had immediately begun using the well water to wipe down Eli's chest when he coughed, warming it gently in a tin pot first. Eli's cough, a dry, rattling thing he'd carried since January, had eased inside a week. Poppy reported this with the careful precision of someone who wanted to believe but wasn't going to be foolish about it. Ivy had been thinking, since then, about steam. The wash house, a lean-to of scavenged pine lumber and canvas she'd been meaning to properly finish, sat near the well. She had read somewhere, in a pamphlet her mother kept with the almanacs, about European bathing houses, about the use of steam in treating lung complaints. She had turned this over many times, measuring it against what she could actually build, what she could heat, what she could offer without pretending to be something she wasn't. A doctor, she was not. A healer, she could not claim. But she could make a warm place. She could heat water. She could offer people something clean and soothing and human at a time when the fever was making everything feel merciless and cold. The risk was the well itself. People already called it cursed. The Pattersons, who ran a small operation 2 miles south, had told their hands to stay away from Mercer Land specifically because of it. If she brought people here and something went wrong, if the fever spread, if someone worsened, there would be no recovering the land's reputation or her family's. She looked at Martin Henderson struggling to breathe in the back of that wagon. She made her decision. Bring him inside, Ivy said. Seth, get the lean-to fire started. Use the good wood. Mrs. Henderson climbed down from the wagon so fast she nearly fell. Seth was already moving. Ivy drew 2 buckets from the green well and carried them to the wash house without letting herself hesitate. She heated them over the iron grate, added a fold of clean cloth to the steam, and arranged Martin Henderson on the low bench she'd built from fence planks and burlap padding. She had no medicine. She had warmth, steam, clean water, and the particular quality of attention her mother had modeled without ever naming it. She began. Poppy had been watching from the doorway. When Mrs. Henderson sat down in the yard, exhausted and wrung out from 3 days of worry and rough road, Poppy brought her water without being asked. Well water, warmed, with a small sprig of dried mint floating in it, because their mother had always said mint made plain things feel considered. Mrs. Henderson looked at the cup, looked at this 13-year-old girl standing straight in a faded blue dress, and something in her face eased. Thank you, child, she said. You're welcome, said Poppy. You can rest here. Martin Henderson spent 2 days at the Mercer claim. He slept on the low bench in the wash house while steam rose around him from buckets of mineral water Ivy reheated every few hours. She did not claim the water was medicine. She said it was warm and clean, which it was. She kept damp cloths over his chest and encouraged him to breathe slowly when he could. She fed him broth made from the last of their cured bones and a handful of dried onion. Mrs. Henderson slept in the house, in Poppy and Ivy's room, and did not argue about it. On the 3rd morning, Martin Henderson sat up on his own. His color was not right yet, still pale under the weathering, still careful in his movements. But his eyes were clear, and he asked for bread, which Ivy took as an excellent sign. Mrs. Henderson cried, briefly, into her apron. Seth fixed the wagon wheel. Eli, who had been carrying buckets for 2 days and felt deeply important about it, brought Martin a cup of water from the well with both hands. Martin looked at the cup, at the boy, at the well behind him. That's the famous cursed well, is it? He said. Yes, sir, said Eli, but we think it's friendly. Martin Henderson drank. He said nothing for a moment. Then, Warm. Always is, said Eli. When the Hendersons left that afternoon, Martin tucked $3 into Ivy's hand and held it there a moment, like he was trying to say something more than money could carry. Mrs. Henderson left a full sack of cornmeal, a bolt of unbleached muslin, and a dozen candles. Before she climbed up to the seat, she turned back to Ivy. "I'm going to tell people about this place," she said. It wasn't a question. Ivy thought about the Patterson family 2 miles south who'd warned their hands away. She thought about the tobacco tin under the floorboards with its diminishing $31. "Tell them we have warm water and somewhere to rest," she said. "Tell them it's clean." The first week after the Hendersons left, Ivy and Seth began building in earnest. The lean-to wash house was the seed, but it wasn't enough. Seth pulled apart the old fence section that had heaved beyond repair and used the lumber to extend the shed by 8 feet. He was 16 and had learned framing by watching and then doing, and his joints were clean and his angles true. Ivy worked beside him without self-consciousness, measuring twice, cutting with the pull saw, asking questions when she didn't know something, and figuring it out when she did. They fitted 2 long benches inside, wide enough to lie down on if needed. They built a stone channel to carry water from the well to a pair of iron basins set over the grate, so water could be heated continuously without carrying bucket by bucket. Seth designed a simple vent in the roof that could be opened or closed to manage the steam. Ivy stitched curtains from the Hendersons' muslin, privacy panels between the benches, small and practical. Poppy organized the outside. She arranged flat stones into a path from the road, collected by the armful over 3 afternoons. She planted the 2 clay pots she'd been keeping since autumn, with dried lavender and rosemary cuttings, setting them at either side of the wash house door because she said a door should let you know it welcomes you. Eli hauled water and counted buckets and kept a small fire going under the second grate with the religious devotion of someone assigned an important post. The well itself they left open and visible. Ivy had decided, no more covering, no apology for what it was. She built a low surround from the flat stones that had always been scattered nearby, mortared loosely with clay, and set a wooden ladle on a hook where anyone could use it. Standing back to look at it on a Friday evening, with the last light making the water in the well glow like something from the deep earth, Seth said, "It doesn't look cursed now." "It never was," said Ivy. They came slowly at first, the way uncertain things begin. 1 family, then a pause, then 2 more. A ranch hand named Obadiah arrived on horseback, stiff-shouldered and suspicious, sent by his employer because his hands had cracked so badly he couldn't grip a rope. He stood outside the wash-house door for a full minute before he went in, and he came out 20 minutes later, flexing his fingers with a look of focused surprise, as if his body had done something without his permission. He left a quarter on the stone surround of the well and rode back without saying much. He returned 4 days later with 2 other ranch hands and a burlap sack of dried beans. The Calloway family arrived in a wagon so full it seemed assembled from everything they owned. Mrs. Calloway had 4 children, the youngest still nursing, and a cough that had been deepening for 2 weeks. Mr. Calloway had a kind face hammered flat by exhaustion. They stayed 2 days. Mrs. Calloway's cough did not vanish. Ivy was careful never to suggest it would. But she slept soundly for the first time in weeks, and something about the steam seemed to ease the tightness enough that she could breathe without bracing for it. When they left, they gave Ivy a live hen, a coil of good rope, and 12 feet of oak board Mr. Calloway had been carrying for a project he no longer had the energy to think about. Word moved through the district the way water moves through dry ground, finding every crack. The green well at the Mercer claim, children running it themselves, water warm and clear and strange, in a place that would let you lie down and rest. Some people came skeptical. They approached the well with the wariness reserved for things that should not exist, and probably didn't work, and they let Ivy show them the basins and the steam bench and the ladle on its hook, and they tried it because they were too tired and sick to keep up the skepticism. Some of them left saying they felt better. Others said nothing except thank you. A few came back. Ivy kept records in the back of her mother's almanac, not medical records, but the kind a practical mind keeps when it needs to understand what's working, which preparations seemed most soothing for lung complaints, how long people needed in the steam, what temperature the basins should be for raw skin versus deep aches, what simple food helped most after. She was building knowledge the way Seth built frames, one true piece at a time. Poppy had become the first face people saw when they arrived, which had happened naturally and seemed right. She had a quality of attentiveness that made tired people feel noticed without feeling burdened, and she never startled anyone or crowded them. She kept the path swept and the pots watered, and the small bench by the door stocked with the warmed mint water she had started offering as welcome. Several women told Ivy privately that the girl had a gift. Eli had appointed himself keeper of the supply record. He had a notebook Seth had given him, a ledger bought at the Bracken Rise dry goods store in January for a school project that hadn't happened, and he tracked every exchange with careful handwriting and deep satisfaction. 1 sack cornmeal, $2 coin. 1 hen, named by Eli Beatrice. Rope, boards, 3 blankets, 1 small saw. The tobacco tin under the floorboards was no longer the only place they kept money. Seth did not say much about any of it, but one evening he stood beside Ivy at the well after the last visitors had gone and watched the steam rise from the green water in the cooling dusk. Pa always said this land would amount to something, he said. Ivy watched the light on the water, that strange, brilliant, mineral green, glowing quietly like a secret the earth had been keeping. He just didn't know what, she said. June arrived, and with it the fever's worst week. 2 families came in the same day. The Aldrich family from the South Fork, and a mother named Mrs. Reyes, traveling alone with a boy of about 8, who had not spoken in 4 days. Ivy stood in the center of the claim and looked at what she had: a wash house built for 6, water for 12, provisions enough for a week, 2 siblings who knew what to do without being told, and 1 brother who carried buckets like the whole endeavor rested on each trip. She had been helping people one at a time. This was going to require something larger. The problem arrived not in the form of one difficulty, but in the slow accumulation of several, the way a dry country storm builds. Nothing, and then everywhere at once. First, the provisions. They had come a long way on the generosity of those who'd visited, but with 2 families and scattered others arriving in the same week. What had felt like sufficiency became visible as its limit. The cornmeal sacks were half empty. The beans were portioned thin. They had no more dried meat, and the hens were producing well, but not lavishly. Eli's ledger showed exchanges going out faster than they came in, and though he reported this with the composed air of a counting house clerk, Ivy could see from his face that the numbers troubled him. Second, the well itself had drawn attention it hadn't sought. Word had traveled to Bracken Rise proper, and the nature of it had changed in the transmission, the way rumors always change, accumulating drama, losing fact. Ivy heard from Mrs. Calloway, who came by again with a neighbor, that people in town were calling the well miraculous. The word made Ivy's stomach tighten. She had never claimed the water cured anything. She had been careful, deliberate, almost austere in what she said about it. But she could not control what people chose to believe or repeat. And miraculous was the kind of word that drew the wrong kind of attention. People hoping for more than she could deliver, and others, the skeptical, the proprietary, the simply contrary, who would want to shut down something that had outgrown its origin. Third, the distrust that had always been there sharpened. Mr. Patterson, who ran the largest operation within 5 miles, had never spoken to Ivy directly, but she heard from ranch hands that he was unhappy about the well's growing reputation. His stated concern was disease spread, that gathering sick people in one location would concentrate and transmit the fever, not alleviate it. It was a concern Ivy took seriously. She had thought about it herself, had structured the benches and the airflow and the wash protocol specifically with this in mind. But she knew that a concern, in the mouth of a powerful man, could become a position, and a position could become an obstacle. The Aldrich family needed more than she had to give. Mr. Aldrich had the fever well advanced and needed continuous steam, which required constant fire, which required fuel she was burning faster than Seth could gather. Their 2 youngest were worn thin and prone to crying, which they did softly and with apology, which was somehow harder than louder grief. Mrs. Aldrich was one of those competent frontier women who manage their own helplessness by looking for tasks, and she attached herself to Poppy's side and helped with great efficiency and, Ivy suspected, to keep from sitting still long enough to be afraid. The boy traveling with Mrs. Reyes still had not spoken. Ivy had learned his name was Clem, 8 years old. His mother, the real one, Mrs. Reyes explained quietly, had died 3 weeks ago, and Mrs. Reyes was a neighbor bringing him to a cousin's family in the next territory. He sat where he was placed, ate when food was given, watched Eli with the blankly focused attention of someone trying to understand a foreign language. Eli, for his part, seemed to understand this perfectly. He simply sat beside Clem without requiring anything, offering his ledger to look at, pointing out the hen Beatrice in the yard, producing small observations about the well and the sky with the comfortable authority of a boy who has decided silence is just another kind of company. It was the first time Ivy had allowed herself to think, we might be in over our heads. On a Thursday afternoon, Mr. Patterson came himself. He arrived on a good horse with a straight back and the kind of unhurried authority that announces itself before anyone speaks. He was perhaps 50, with a weathered face and careful eyes, the sort of man who had made himself into a fixture of the district through long effort and did not intend to see that disrupted. He dismounted at the stone path and looked at the well surround, the clay pots with their lavender, the washed clean curtain visible through the open wash-house door. His expression was neutral in the way that neutral expressions sometimes are, masking a conclusion already reached. "Miss Mercer," he said. He was looking at the Aldrich wagon, the visiting horses, the general evidence of a place that had become something. "Mr. Patterson," said Ivy. She had been expecting him, in the way you expect rain when the light changes. She had prepared herself, not for confrontation, but for the kind of conversation that required steadiness above argument. He expressed his concerns methodically. The gathering of the sick was irresponsible. She had no training. The water was an unknown quantity, and she was presenting it to vulnerable people without any honest accounting of what it was or what it might do. His operation had hands who had families who came near this district, and he was not willing to see the fever spread because a 19-year-old girl had decided to play at medicine. He didn't say it cruelly. He said it the way men of his type said difficult things, in measured language, with the reasonable-sounding confidence of someone who has already decided what's true. Ivy let him finish. Then she said, "You're right that I have no training. I've told every person who came here exactly that. I've never called the water medicine. I've never promised a cure." She walked him to the wash house. She showed him the benches, the ventilation, the wash basins, the separate area where linens were boiled and dried before reuse. She showed him the stone channel Seth had engineered, so water moved clean rather than carried. Then she walked him through the protocol. The temperature of the water, the way steam was managed, the reason the benches were spaced as they were. She answered his questions without defensiveness, without apology, and without elaborating beyond what was true. He was quiet for a while. Then he walked to the well and looked down into the water. She watched him see the color, that vivid, warm, particular green, and register the faint rising steam and the smell, which was mineral and clean, like stone after rain. "It's real," he said, which she understood to mean he had not entirely believed it until now. "It's always been real," she said. "It was just covered up." He stood there a few more minutes. She did not fill the silence. She was thinking about Seth, who was out gathering fuel and would be back soon. About Poppy, inside with Mrs. Aldrich, explaining in her careful way how to wick steam toward a person's breathing without scalding. About Eli, sitting beside a boy who didn't speak, being beside him anyway. She was thinking about what her mother had said. What frightens people and what helps them. Patterson put his hat back on. "You need timber," he said, "for the roof extension you're going to need before summer ends if this keeps up." It was not an apology. It was something more useful. "I know," she said. "I haven't figured out where it's coming from yet." He nodded once, mounted his horse, and rode back toward his land without saying anything more. That night, Ivy sat alone at the well after everyone slept. She was tired in a way she couldn't fully locate. In her hands, yes, and in her back, but deeper than that. The kind of tired that isn't about hours but about carrying. She looked down into the green water. They were nearly out of cornmeal. They had no more dried meat. They had people who depended on them now, which was not something she had planned for and was not something she could undo. She had started something she didn't entirely know how to finish. The water glowed green in the dark, warm and steady, indifferent to her uncertainty. She let herself think the things she normally didn't allow in daylight. What if it didn't last? What if the well dried or changed, or the fever passed, and with it all the goodwill and the sacks of cornmeal and the coins in the tobacco tin? What if Patterson told others what he'd seen, and they came with authority and papers, and told 4 orphaned children that what they'd built was a liability rather than a gift? What if she had put her brothers and sister at risk for something that would dissolve at the first hard season? She had been brave for 5 months. She had been practical and steady, and she had not cried in front of anyone. Not once, because crying was a door she was afraid to open. She cried now, quietly, at the edge of the well in the dark. She cried for her parents, for the winter, for the weight of being 19 and the oldest, and the one who had to know what to do. She cried because Eli still expected things to be all right, and she could not bear the thought of proving him wrong. Then she looked at the well again. The water was still there, still warm, still that impossible, faithful green, still offering what it had always offered, something real, when you needed it most. She wiped her face. She went inside. In the morning, Seth had coffee ready before she woke. He had risen early, she could tell. There was fresh water in the basins, and the grate was banked. He had also, without explanation, begun extending the eastern wall of the washhouse by himself in the gray pre-dawn, and there were 2 new boards mortised neatly into place. He handed her the cup and didn't ask how she was. "Patterson sent a cartload of timber," he said. "It was waiting at the road this morning." Ivy drank her coffee. "Let's build," she said. The timber arrived first, then the rest. 3 men from the Patterson operation came that same morning, sent without much explanation, except that Patterson had given permission, and they knew how to build. They were quiet, practical men who assessed Seth's existing framing without condescension and fitted into the work like they'd been planned for it. Seth directed them with the particular focused calm of a 16-year-old who has had to become more competent than his age, and they followed without fuss, which told Ivy more about their character than anything they said. By afternoon, the roof extension was framed. By the following morning, it was covered. What had been a lean-to became a proper structure, low but solid, stone-footed and timber-framed, with a canvas ceiling that could be rolled back in good weather to let the steam breathe outward. Seth built 2 additional stone channels, this time with a gravity feed from a raised barrel that Eli had filled and refilled all morning with undisguised pride. The basins were arranged along the north wall, the benches along the south, and a separate curtained area at the east end gave privacy to women and children. Poppy organized it with the attention of someone laying a table for a difficult guest. Everything in its place, everything thought through. She found flat-topped stones to serve as side tables beside each bench. She tied dried sage bundles at intervals along the wall, because sage, she said, made a room smell like it meant well. She placed a basket of folded clean cloths at the entrance and replenished it without being asked. The Aldrich family stayed through the building and helped where they could, Mrs. Aldrich proving to be an efficient hand at mortar, and Mr. Aldrich, who was recovering steadily, taking on the lighter hauling with a determination that had something personal in it, as though helping build the place that had helped him was a form of accounting he needed to complete. And Clem spoke. Not much, but on the 4th day, while Eli was showing him how the gravity barrel worked, the float, the valve, the way the water level told you what to do next, Clem said quietly, "Who built that?" "Seth," said Eli. "But I helped figure the float part." Clem looked at the barrel, then at the well. "Is the water really green?" "See for yourself," said Eli, and handed him the ladle. Clem looked into the well for a long time. The water was brilliant in the midday light, that living, mineral green, warm and faintly steaming, the color of new leaves against stone. He reached the ladle in and brought it up full and looked at it as if he'd found something he hadn't known he was missing. He didn't say anything else that day, but he wasn't silent in the same way anymore. People came through the rest of June and into July. The fever was beginning to turn, not all at once, but the way bad things turned when a community held together, one family at a time. The Mercer claim had become a known place on the district's rough map of itself, not because of anything miraculous, but because of something more ordinary and harder to dismiss. It was somewhere you could go and be cared for and leave feeling more like yourself. The gifts accumulated the way trust accumulates, unpredictably, in whatever form a person had available. A barrel of salt pork from a ranch family who'd had a good spring. Seedlings from a woman who had 3 gardens and counted herself lucky. A small iron stove that a widower brought in a wagon, saying he had no use for it since he'd moved to a single room and he could see the Mercers had use for everything. Seeds. Rope. A second mule, older but steady, given by a family moving east who could not take it with them. Chickens enough that Eli had to build a second pen and named every one of them. The tobacco tin under the floorboards now had company, a second tin and a small cedar box, and a proper account Eli kept in the ledger with the handwriting of someone who had discovered he was good at numbers and intended to be very good at them. On a Saturday in mid-July, the Bracken Rise district held its quarterly gathering at the crossroads, the kind of loose, social assembly that served as church and market and town meeting all in one. And Ivy went, which she had not done since her parents died. People knew her. Not as the orphan girl from the hard claim east of the road, not as the child with the cursed well. They knew her the way communities know the people who have done something, directly, by name, by a dozen accounts from a dozen mouths, women whose children had breathed easier, ranch hands whose hands had healed, families who had rested when rest had seemed impossible. An older woman named Mrs. Dunbar, who ran the closest thing the district had to a store, shook Ivy's hand and held it and said, "You've done a good thing, child." Ivy thought about saying it was the water, it was my brothers and sister, it was all the people who came and helped and left what they could, all of which was true. Instead, she said, "Thank you." Seth stood beside her and didn't say much, but stood with the quiet uprightness of someone who has carried weight and is beginning to set it down. Poppy held Eli's hand and looked at everything with her careful dark eyes. Eli looked at everything else. The land east of the crossroads was still hardpan and sagebrush, still wind-beaten, still marked by the ordinary difficulties of the high desert in a dry year. But it was theirs, and there was something in it now, something warm and green and real, that people came toward instead of away from. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. On a morning in late July, Ivy walked out before the others woke and stood at the well in the early light. The steam rose thin and straight in the still air. The water was its impossible green, warm, mineral, ancient, belonging entirely to itself. She thought about the woman who had arrived at dawn with her son. She thought about Clem with the ladle. She thought about timber arriving at the road like an answered question. She dipped her hands in, still warm, still real. Behind her, she heard Eli's footsteps, unhurried, confident, coming out to start the morning fire. She straightened up and turned around to meet the day.